right. Hello, folks. Here we go. So, we're gonna have a discussion about the last supplementary topic, and this is about the role of consciousness or what makes someone morally worthy, what gives person status to someone, and what are the implications of this in medical ethics. So, the starting point is that obviously um, people inevitably become unconscious sometimes or lack a well working mind sometimes. Think about the end of life. Many people have more than one complex problem, say cancer and diabetes and pneumonia at the same time, and at some point they receive medicines to be asleep most of the time. Otherwise, they would experience too much physical suffering, discomfort, and anguish, right? Fear, panic, shock, and so on. Horrible feelings, terror, not being able to breathe, and such things can make people feel really, really bad, right? So their quality of life would be too bad. But it doesn't mean that once they're asleep and they don't have conscious experiences anymore, they stop being persons, right? And the same is true of people whose minds work in strange ways or don't work at all at certain points of their life. But then, of course, the question comes: what makes something a holder of rights or a subject of morality? How should we think about these things in general? And why care for people who don't seem to be able to use their minds anymore? Okay. Um, Understood the other way around, what beings do we have to care about morally? Um, Often in philosophy, it has been posited that rationality is necessary. We're going to consider this, and sometimes it's been proposed that maybe maybe um, maybe instead of rationality, the ability to experience pain or pleasure is important for being able to have a life that can be morally valuable. Okay, so the proposal that I'm really interested in, and I'm going to structure this short presentation around that, is going to be tied to the idea to um, being a living being is enough to have moral worth, to be morally considerable. Considerable means that if someone's actions influence whether you live or not, whether you are harmed or not, whether you can continue your life the way you usually do or not, they have to really think about this, and they have to take the reasons for and against very seriously. So the idea is living beings all have moral worth, moral value, and they deserve some protections. Kenneth Goodpaster has a paper on moral considerability, and he defends a version of this position, I think, very well. And he says about living being that such beings are morally considerable, so we have to take their interests, not to suffer, not to die, not to feel terror and fear seriously. Now, obviously, this is interesting in the sense that not all beings have minds, and at some points we may have minds, but we may not be able to use them because we are unconscious, we are asleep, we suffered trauma, and due to some damage to our bodies, our brain is not able to generate the kind of conscious experience that we normally have, right? And that's very important to what makes our lives valuable and good or bad. Goodpaster makes four distinctions to help discuss this topic. One is that rights are not the same as moral considerability, right? So sometimes people try to say that, look, only humans or only some groups of humans are morally considerable, because thinking of rights only makes sense in their case. Rights are things that, if you have a right, it means other people have to respect your right, and in some cases they have to help you to be able to enjoy your rights, like the right to health or education or a safe life. Right, the police help us to have safety, the education system helps us to get education, the healthcare system helps us to stay healthy, and so on. And we all work together to keep these systems going. If someone doesn't, obviously they are not doing their job, not doing their part, and that's a problematic thing. There are sometimes good reasons. Someone might be very old or very poor, but there are bad reasons as well. Someone gets too many tax exemptions or cheats on their taxes or hides their money or something like that. Also, rights come with duties. If I have rights, I live in a community that the idea of rights makes sense, that I have duties as well. There's no one who only has rights, right? So, for example, sometimes people misunderstand the idea, different rights to different freedoms, and if there is a pandemic, obviously I have a duty to respect the right to health of other people as well, which might justify limiting everyone's freedom of movement or other kinds of freedoms for as long as pandemic makes it necessary. Sometimes people think that, oh, if you have a right, that's absolute, it trumps everything. You don't have to take anyone else into account, but that's obviously not how rights work. Rights come with duties, and that's the only way they make sense, because otherwise nobody would have a duty to respect our rights either. Now, only humans stand in the right, so in our kind of social relations, to claim rights and have duties. So obviously, if we think about rights, we're going to have a narrow circle. Animals won't be able to participate in taking on duties, and so talking about animal rights makes only sense in some derivative sense. Some people argue that some beings can have rights without being able to have duties. So some humans, like fetuses, developing babies or young children, cannot take on many duties, but at least they have the potential to do so later in their lives. So it's one way to look at this. Now, the point that Goodpaster makes here is that, look, rights are not the same as moral considerability. So someone should be taken seriously morally. That is, we shouldn't just kill them or harm them or hurt them or misuse them or use them as a tool just because they are not humans. Okay, so animals, even plants and other potentially living beings, if there are in the future cyborgs or other living beings, aliens that we encounter, they might not be members of a community of rights in the way that members of our society can be, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to morally care about them. Okay, so this is not the same questions. We might say that rights only apply to humans or adult humans or humans and beings that can potentially develop the right abilities needed to make sense of rights and duties, but that cannot be where moral considerability stops. Also, moral significance is not the same as moral considerability, right? So sometimes we think of things like experiments, medical experiments, for the sake of developing some treatment for a condition that affects a lot of people, and often in these experiments we use animals, and often if you think about plants, often plants are destroyed to make place for new building projects and so on. Obviously, morally, the animals used in experiments are considerable, and we should do everything to avoid having to use them. If we can use instead computer simulations or volunteers or other things, then probably often that's going to be the right way to do these things, but it might not be always possible, and in those cases we have to think about the moral significance, right? So Not everyone would agree, but many would agree that using for an experiment a rabbit is less bad than using, say, a child or a human, another human. Um, the moral significance of the harm done to a human would be greater than the harm done to the rabbit. It doesn't mean that the harm done to the rabbit is not significant and we shouldn't try to avoid it or minimize it or make sure that we in the future we don't have to harm animals in experiments. Um, but at least it's not a totally impossible position to argue for that there is smaller moral significance to that harm, or there is smaller moral significance to a tree being killed in the process of building a house uh, than to the rights, the moral significance of the rights of the humans for whom the house is built. Um, Again, if this can be avoided, of course it should be, and we should minimize death and suffering on the part of all living beings. I think humanity could do a lot more than what we're doing, and hopefully animal experimentation we can get rid of at some point if our computer models become, scientific models become high quality enough to do that, our scientific knowledge advances far enough, and also building, hopefully we can develop better models of creating new living spaces. But this is again a separate issue, right? We can't say that a tree is morally considerable, an animal is morally considerable, but not to the same extent as, let's say, a dog would be valued by many people more than certain plants, but maybe not by everyone. There's room for discussion about moral significance, even if there is no room for discussion about moral considerability. Now, another distinction that's important in this context is what makes sense logically to say and not. So, in philosophy, some people, and sometimes this happens in law or other discussions, say, oh, look, moral worth, morality, the way we use these concepts, it doesn't make sense to apply them to animals. The problem is that how we use concepts does not necessarily reflect the facts. So human communities can be systematically wrong, right? Humans who are systematically wrong about the earth being flat for a long time, and even today some people make this mistake. But we know that for a fact the earth is spherical, not perfectly round, but almost. It has been, even when people believe that it is not, right? So the facts were different from what most people believed and how most people used the concept of our planet or Earth. And the same is true of moral questions. At some point in history, for example, if you look at the early 19th century, 1820s, 30s, 40s, many US states paid people to kill Native Americans, and so that their land can be occupied and used by settlers. And often, if you would look at how those people talked or taught or used the concepts that they used to refer to and discuss Native Americans, they would not find them morally considerable, and only in negative ways like disease and other, not necessarily morally bad in themselves. They wouldn't even consider them morally good or bad. They would simply think of them as only having relational value. So it doesn't matter what they are, who they are. It only matters how they affect us. And because we may suffer some, we can't occupy as much land as we want if those people live there. It is okay to kill them because some of our interests are harmed by their living there or constrained. Now, obviously, this is an enormously wrong and selfish way of thinking about things, but this is how people use the concept. So, how people use concepts is not how people think, how most people think or speak, uh, is not telling us or showing us how morality is, in fact, or how facts are in general in the world. So we can't base our understanding of morality simply on our understanding of how people use concepts, um, which means that just because we or many people don't uh, think or say that beings beyond humans have moral worth or moral interests, that doesn't matter really. Maybe they're wrong. And we can distinguish regulative and operative moral claims. So we can sometimes understand a general moral claim as true, like all living things are morally considerable, it's bad to kill them. Um, we can call this a regulative truth. Ideally, we don't kill living things. However, we are not always able to act on all regulative truths. Sometimes this is due to our psychology. Um, we simply cannot understand how some of our actions affect living beings, or cannot foresee some risks of our actions, and we end up hurting living beings. And sometimes this is due to external pressures. If you have to commute to your work every day by car, you are going to kill some number of creatures simply by driving on the road, some bugs, some potentially some smaller animals, and so on. But obviously, you might think this is necessary, and external pressure is that you get to your work on time and you have a job in this society, otherwise it's hard to get by. So what we can act on is operative, not always the same as what the regulative general truths are. Of course, what is operative for people can change over time, right? In some points, we could not save people who had serious kidney disease, but today we have dialysis and we can save them. Same about diabetes and other conditions, many kinds of cancer. Um, and the same about eating, right? So at some points in history, it was justifiable to eat animals or eat a lot of beef, but it is less and less justifiable since there are many better alternatives. If you do have to eat meat for some reason, it's much better to eat the kind of meat that has a lot less impact on the environment than beef and contributes to climate change less. And it's also better to eat animals which had better lives, so they haven't been raised in factory farming, because those animals have much higher qualities of life. Um, and there are many products, not everywhere in the world, and of course not everyone on every income can access, but in high income countries, more and more of us can reduce our meat consumption, and that leads to the killing and suffering of fewer animals, and substitute our diets with alternatives. Right, so that's a possibility, but it wasn't always a possibility, and it's still not always a possibility. So operational and regulative moral truths might be different in the sense that, of course, it would be nice if you wouldn't have to kill any animals to survive. That might not be operative for everyone everywhere. Right? So the main claim that Goodpaster makes in his article is that all living beings are morally considerable in a regulative factual sense, and this does not mean that they all have the highest significance, right? That we can never harm any of them, or that they have rights in the same way that members of human communities have, or that we can always operationally respect their moral laws, right? There might be situations where we just have to choose between killing certain things for survival or for morally important and justifiable goals. The question is still, for some people, why not stop at rationality for moral considerability, right? So there have been proposals where people say that to be morally considerable, to be thought of as someone whose life has value and whose interests we shouldn't hurt, we should only look at the living beings that are rational, that can think about morality, that can understand norms, rules, social conventions, that can maybe understand some basic scientific truths about the world, that can give reasons for and against their decisions, and so on. They can explain why they did something. These are some minimum criteria of rationality, right? That most adult humans have if they're healthy. However, the problem with the strong criterion on rationality is that rationality is something that most fetuses, right, developing babies in a mother's uterus, belly, babies, small children have only potentially, but not actually. Some of them, or most of them, might develop rationality, but they don't actually have it. If you have young children or play with a baby, you know this. They are still developing a lot of the abilities and the capacities that older humans have. And some of them, some humans, right, who are born or acquire serious mental disabilities may not acquire rationality ever. Some people are born with very, very serious conditions where part of their brain might be missing or not has not developed, and so on and so on, and may never be able to develop that potential. But nevertheless, we wouldn't say that these people are not morally considerable. Some people might lose their rationality due to illness. There are several illnesses which undermine the functioning of those areas of the brain which are necessary for our minds to uh, function rationally. So even if you think that the mind and the brain are not the same, or if you think that they are the same in some way, you know, illness might undermine rationality. Some old people lose their rationality, or even middle-aged people, due to these the onset of these illnesses. And someone could have an accident as well, which damages some parts of their body in a way that they cannot be rational anymore. But that doesn't mean that such people are not morally considerable anymore, and surely we would not say that, oh, you know, when someone stops being rational, they stop being morally relevant, so it's okay to kill them off or use them for experiments or other such things. So rationality might be a very important criterion for morality, especially when it comes to discussions of responsibility, who we can hold responsible. And rationality is something that in this sense, organizations can be rational, governments can be rational, militaries can be rational, AIs can be rational, humans can be rational, and accordingly we can blame these things or praise these things, reward or punish these things. But it's not the same, it's a narrower circle and a little bit different circle from moral considerability. Um, Another criterion that some people try to use for moral considerability is the ability to experience pleasure and pain, or more broadly understood, being sentient and having experiences. Um, and that sounds very plausible in the sense, if you think about it, that much of what makes life worth living, not just necessarily for humans, but probably also for a lot of animals or all animals, is when we experience joys, pleasures, and much of the bad in life comes from suffering, fear, uh, pain, emotional trauma, depression, losing hope, and so on, terror, being afraid, being scared, being humiliated, and so on, being ashamed. Now, obviously, if this is your view, then you would say that, look, those things have moral considerability, that where we can make sense of moral good and moral bad in these terms of having pleasure and pain, right? So having positive experiences or bad experiences, and you can include perceptual experiences, physical feelings, emotions, and so on. Experiencing having an idea, experiencing a beautiful sunset, watching a wonderful movie, seeing something gorgeous, having a wonderful dish, spending great time with your family and friends, or in terms of animals, you can think of how happy a dog is if you play together, or how happy your cat is and how contented it is when it's sleeping on your lap, and so on and so on. Now, Goodpaster argues that this is again a little bit too narrow, and not just too narrow, but again, it runs into a couple of problems. One is that at many junctions in life, let's say when we're unconscious again, for whatever reason, or our mental capacities or capacities to experience the world damaged, we lose some of these abilities, but that doesn't seem to affect our moral considerability. And someone who's in a coma is still morally considerable, and at least for a while, and they certainly have interests. Now the other is that you can think of pleasure and pain and general sensation as just tools of living beings for adaptability. So you could think of these things as signals that yes, we are doing something. Pleasant things are signals that have evolutionarily developed to tell us you're doing something that increases your adaptability, which ideally increases your fitness and you can pass on your genes better and so on, which is the point of evolution. Pain the opposite. Not every being has developed this kind of system. There are many living beings that rely on different systems. You can think of flowers, and you can think of plants, and even among animals there are very different kinds of sensations and being sentient. Right? Some animals use echolocation. It might be a very different way of being conscious, relying on echolocation, than the way we rely on, say, seeing and smelling and touch. So, that criteria might again exclude living beings. And, the link here is that the good things are the good experiences, the bad, morally bad things are the bad experiences. So, only beings with this kind of conscious experiences have anything morally interesting and relevant in their life. And if a plant, for example, doesn't have this kind of, it doesn't have anything that we could consider morally relevant. But that's obviously not true in the sense that if we look at experiences in this evolutionary framework, then a tree very much has an interest that we can understand in growing and developing its seeds and shedding them and so on. So again, this criterion seems to draw the circle somewhat too narrow. But another question that we might have then is, shouldn't morality be limited to those things whose interests we can represent in some substantial way? How can we understand the interests of a tree? It doesn't doesn't seem to have a mind like ours, so it doesn't seem to have desires, wants, aims, values, and goals. And then some people would go on to say that, look, it only has a value for us, right? Like, we may not want to be the kind of person who kills a living being, but that's not about the tree's moral considerability. That's about how we want to think about ourselves. That's our notion of what a good person would do. Surely Goodpaster's argument, reply here, is that living things have an interest in staying alive, and these are not our aims. And for example, a tree can achieve its aims of flowering, prospering, growing, for better or worse, right? Trees compete with each other. If you look at saplings, some of them die away or never become large, because the other ones grow faster, are more efficient, and take away the sunshine and the nutrition from them. And trees surely don't act like we do, and most likely they don't have minds like we do, but that doesn't mean that they don't have any kind of interest. They're not like a rock or a stone, which doesn't have any life-sustaining processes going on in it. The existence of non-living things can go on without any continuous biological processes keeping them realized as the functioning system that they are. And what follows if we accept this idea? One thing that follows is that we should take the considerability of living beings more seriously, right? So when we think about, we might harm animals, or we could benefit animals or plants in some way, that should be a morally relevant consideration. And when we are planning architectural work, building work, buying products, traveling, we should think of these things because they impact other living beings in serious ways, not just us. Um, and of course, this is very relevant when we buy food as well. Uh, we we are doing morally relevant things. Morality does enter buying medication, cosmetics, which might be tested on animals, makeup, entertainment products, which might have been built in places where nature is harmed and so on. Some people, when it comes to nature, say, but look, we're natural creatures, you brought up living beings, evolution, and so on, and we evolved in a way that we have to kill other things or destroy other things sometimes to survive, which is, of course, true. But if you consider nature, nature doesn't really allow for, and most animals and other creatures don't engage in killing for fun. There's very little destruction that happens without reason. There's destruction by chance or misfortune, but killing and harming for fun is very rare. Most killing and harming happens for survival. And even more importantly, what how nature works is quite irrelevant to morality. We humans are very fortunate in the sense that we managed to learn how to control nature, and we build societies which have laws, customs, culture, and our lives today are not regulated by anything like natural laws or biological laws or evolutionary laws. Our lives are nothing like that. This is very easy to see if you, example, consider something like rape, right? Almost everyone today in the world agrees that rape is morally deeply wrong because it causes very, very severe harm to someone. It violates their consent, it destroys their autonomy. But rape is very common in nature among animals, and probably it was at some early stages of the evolution of modern humans, because through rape you can pass on your genes more efficiently, right? So if you are logged into that system where that's the only thing that matters, of course, this is a viable mean that you can argue for. But our societies now have very different goals and norm systems, so we don't have to care much about how nature works. And in fact, probably it's a very bad idea. Darwin writes in his book about the emotions and human development that one of the things that's a huge advantage for humans is that we can cooperate, and we can work together and aid each other super well. And this ability has gone far beyond anything that nature would make necessary, or nature would give us reasons to do. But it leads to wonderful, very rich, thriving societies where our lives are nothing like the lives of animals that have to rely on nature, right? Most of us never experience having to hunt or being hunted and things like that, luckily. So, one of the interesting things here is, of course, that moral considerability might be something that is only followable by rational creatures, right? So those those of us, humans and other creatures who can be rational, can care about the moral considerability of humans and other beings. And of course, a lot of morally considerable beings don't have the right capacities to represent moral rules or think about them and so on. So they won't be able to think about this. But it does not does not mean that those creatures cannot have moral considerability and moral value. Now, what does this mean in the medical context? Right, it means that the value of of life, including human lives, of course, um, goes beyond rationality and the ability to experience pain or pleasure. Why is this important? It's important because, as I said, for many medical or other reasons, we might lose such abilities or not yet have them, like developing children and so on. But that does not mean that we don't have moral considerability. So, right, you might support that in some cases it is maybe better not to bring a child into life if it would be extremely heavily disabled or ill, and its life would be definitely mostly suffering under a level of quality which makes life worth living. Um, but doesn't mean that you're saying that, oh, it's okay to perform an abortion on such a child, such a fetus, uh, because it doesn't have moral worth yet, right? The justification has to be a moral and a strong one, and it has to be that in some such cases, it is okay to perform an abortion exactly because someone who is morally considerable will be spared a life of a life that would not be worth living and would be filled with pain, confusion, terror, right? Children's consciousness is not structured yet as ours, so everything is very confusing and difficult to process at the beginning. And the same might be true of people in a coma or at the end of their lives, right? When people stop having conscious experiences, it doesn't mean that they stop having moral considerability. They might lose what can make life enjoyable for them, right? There are good arguments for thinking. Joshua Shepard has a very interesting book on morality and consciousness, and there's much similar work where you could argue that you know the good things that we experience, the good for us, or happiness, is tied to our ability in some way to have experiences, and maybe having the experiences themselves, of having certain kinds of evaluative experiences that we live as good experiences, are things that make life worth living. But just because those experiences might not be accessible to some people, it doesn't mean that they don't have moral considerability again, right? So they might get to a stage of their life at which the quality of life that they have, is simply not good anymore because they cannot have good experiences. But the decision whether or not we should, for example, keep someone in a long-term permanent coma should still be a moral decision, and we still have to weigh what's morally in the best reason of that patient. Could there be a treatment that's likely to be discovered or developed in the next years that could reverse the state of that person? How does the death of that person affect others in their family? Would that person have wanted to be kept alive, and so on? So the this again doesn't mean that it's never permissible, right, to perform some kind of passive euthanasia, where we say that it's hopeless. This person's brain is so damaged that no matter what leaps and crazy developments happen in science, we'll never be able to help this person to be a person again and experience things and live actively. It might be the morally justified reason to let them go and help them have a dignified death, but that's again a reason that we have to take. That's a decision that we have to take after considering their moral worth. So, yeah, interesting topic. And right then, the moral significance comes into play again that we discussed earlier, right? The moral significance of someone who has been in a coma for a long, long time is going to be very different from someone who is active and being able to live and experience things actively. But both of these people have moral significance, and not a negligible amount of moral significance. Right. On that note, thank you for your attention. I hope you found this topic interesting, and hope to see you around for another one. Have a great day.